Bath, autumn, 1882. A mist-laced city holds its breath as Glenda Hartwell arrives with a failing mother and a steadiness the world has never bothered to admire. In the hushed archives of the assembly rooms, dust blooms like memory, until a tall, guarded duke steps from the shadows. One glance and the room tilts, a railway built on whispers, a ledger that will not lie, a heart taught to choose duty over desire. Something long buried strains toward the light, an old grief, a secret sum, an impossible choice. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances, the longing, the scandal, or the hard-won, grown-up kind of love? Bath, England, the autumn of 1882. The hills that surrounded the city shimmered with a pale, coppery glow as the last leaves of October clung stubbornly to their branches. A thin mist floated above the cobblestones, wrapping the ancient crescents and terraces in a silvery veil that made every gaslight tremble like a distant star. The sound of carriage wheels echoed through the narrow streets, mingling with the scent of rain and coal smoke. It was into this melancholy beauty that Glenda Hartwell arrived, carrying her mother's frail hopes and her own quiet resolve. At 39, Glenda was a woman who had long since learned the art of silence. She had buried her youth beneath years of duty and care, yet something in her eyes, the soft hazel that caught both gentleness and strength, still glimmered with life. Her modest dress of navy wool, carefully mended at the cuffs, did little to hide the firmness of her bearing. She stepped down from the carriage with the dignity of one who owed nothing to the world but her honesty. The lodging house where she and her mother were to stay stood on a quiet street near the assembly rooms. Its facade was worn but clean, with ivy crawling around the doorway like an old memory refusing to die. Inside, Mrs. Hartwell, pale and tired, was settled into a small chamber overlooking the street. Glenda arranged her mother's pillows and unpacked her few treasured belongings, a silver-framed miniature of her late father, a worn Bible, and a single string of pearls her mother had worn on her wedding day. That evening, as the rain began to fall, Glenda walked to the assembly rooms for the first time. The building loomed above her, grand and slightly forgotten, its windows glowing faintly from the lamplight within. She paused at the threshold, feeling the cold air of the place, an air that smelled of dust, old books, and the echo of voices long gone. Here she was to begin her work, restoring the neglected archives of the city's library, a task no one else had found time or patience for. Inside, the hallways were lined with faded portraits of Bath's former patrons, men in powdered wigs, and women with pearls and solemn smiles. The silence was so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. She climbed the stairs and entered the library. The sight took her breath away. Shelves rose to the ceiling, many broken or warped with dampness, their contents coated in a fine grey film of neglect. The air was thick with the scent of paper and history. She lit a small oil lamp and began to open the windows one by one. The glass rattled with the wind. Each movement of her hands was deliberate, reverent, as though she were waking something that had slept too long. There was peace in the rhythm of dusting, sorting, breathing life back into forgotten volumes. For a while, she almost forgot the ache in her heart, the years of solitude, the quiet sacrifices made without complaint. But solitude has a way of keeping company with fate. She heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind her, measured, heavy, sure. Turning, she found herself face to face with a man whose presence filled the doorway like a shadow come to life. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal coat and gloves of dark leather. His features were sharp, his jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, streaked with grey. The light of the lamp caught his eyes, cold, steel-blue eyes that seemed to weigh her in an instant. "Miss Hartwell, I presume," he said, his tone polite yet distant. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, lowering her gaze only slightly. "I was told I might find the librarian's records here." He stepped closer, glancing around at the disarray of the shelves. "It appears you have inherited chaos," he murmured. These rooms have not been properly tended in years." "I have noticed," Glenda answered, brushing dust from the edge of a table. "But chaos can be set right with patience and with respect for what others have neglected." Her words, though calmly spoken, carried a firmness that made him study her more closely. He was not accustomed to being spoken to in such tones, least of all by a woman in modest attire. "I am Julius Hawke, Duke of Merrow," he said at last, removing one glove with measured grace. "The assembly rooms fall under my patronage. I'm told you will be cataloguing the archives until the new curator arrives from London. I will do my best until then," she replied evenly. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it was not warmth that softened it, more a flicker of curiosity. "And what brought you to Bath, Miss Hartwell? Surely a woman of your age and discernment might have found easier employment in the city." Her fingers froze on the spine of a book. "My mother's health required a change of air. Duty leaves little room for ambition, Your Grace." The words hung between them, like a chord struck in a silent room. Julius inclined his head slightly, but his eyes lingered on her with quiet scrutiny. "You speak as though ambition were a vice." "For some of us," she said, lifting her gaze to meet his, "it is a luxury we cannot afford." He did not reply. For a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that small, dust-filled space, the lamplight trembling between them, the scent of rain through the open window, the distant toll of the Abbey clock. Julius's expression was unreadable, his posture impeccable. Yet there was something restless in his stillness, as if the order of his world had been quietly disturbed. At length he turned toward the door. "If you require assistance, the caretaker will oblige. Good evening, Miss Hartwell." Good evening, Your Grace." He paused as though about to say something more, then simply bowed and departed. The echo of his footsteps faded into the corridor, leaving only the whisper of wind and the slow, deliberate beat of Glenda's heart. She stood motionless for a moment, her hands pressed against the edge of the desk. The air still carried his scent, leather, rain, and something darker, like the weight of secrets unspoken. She exhaled, steadying herself, and looked once more around the room that was now hers to reclaim. Outside, Bath slept beneath its shroud of mist. Inside, a woman of quiet strength lit another lamp and continued her work, unaware that the man whose shadow had just crossed her path would soon alter the still rhythm of her life. The pale morning light filtered through the high-arched windows of the assembly rooms, washing the library in a cold, diffused glow. The air was sharp, with the scent of coal smoke from distant chimneys and the brittle perfume of old paper. Glenda Hartwell stood before a mountain of untouched ledgers, her sleeves neatly rolled to her elbows, a soft smudge of dust on her cheek. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's tolled the hour, 9 o'clock, but in the hush of the archive, time obeyed no such authority. She moved carefully through the rows of shelves, the wooden floor creaking beneath her steady footsteps. Each volume she opened held decades of civic pride and negligence, debtors' ledgers, charitable donations, attendance records for long-forgotten dances, some pages crisp with disuse, others swollen from water damage, their ink bled into illegibility. As her gloved fingers passed over brittle bindings and faded margins, Glenda found something deeply soothing in the rhythm of her work. She did not expect the ledgers to speak, and yet she listened. In the corner of the room, a small cast-iron stove offered feeble warmth, its orange glow casting trembling shadows against the stone wall. It had taken her nearly a week to convince the caretaker to light it. Now it stood like a mute companion to her labor, hissing softly as she turned pages and filled her logbook with crisp, slanted handwriting. Just as she leaned down to lift another heavy ledger, this one stamped Municipal Accounts, 1874, a sound caught her ear. It was so faint she almost dismissed it, the whisper of movement, the scrape of a shoe, the rustle of fabric. She turned her head slowly, holding her breath. "Hello?" she called gently. No answer came, only silence. Still, Glenda's instincts, sharpened by years of caregiving and caution, prickled with awareness. She set the book aside and walked quietly toward the side alcove, a narrow corridor lined with lesser-used records. There, behind a stack of damaged folios, crouched a girl. She could not have been older than 17. Her gown was thin, patched at the elbows, and her boots had long since lost their shine. Her reddish-blonde hair was pinned in a hurried twist, and her face, so young, so pale, was streaked with dirt and panic. She looked up as Glenda approached, her wide, grey-blue eyes filled with fear. I didn't take anything," the girl stammered, clutching a canvas bundle against her chest. "I just needed a place to breathe." Glenda knelt slowly, careful not to startle her. "No one's accusing you, child, but you must tell me who you are and how you came to be here." The girl blinked, visibly shaking. Ada Finch. I'm apprenticed to Mrs. Redding, the dressmaker on Queen Street, or I was." Glenda nodded. The name was familiar. "What happened?" Ada bit her lip. Her fingers clutched the hem of her skirt so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I saw something I shouldn't have. Last night. In the warehouse behind the mill. I only went there to look for Miss Redding's cat. She said he often sleeps in the crates. I heard voices." The girl's breath quickened as she spoke, her words tumbling out like stones spilling from a broken wall. "There were men inside. One of them was Sir Lionel Pierce. I recognized him from the newspapers. He was speaking to two others, one a surveyor, I think. They were arguing about bribes, about how much it would take to push the railway through Stone Market Lane. They said it would be easier to pay off the poor than fight the city. And then—" She stopped, tears brimming in her eyes. "They heard a noise. I dropped the lantern. I ran. I didn't go back to the shop. I came here because I knew no one would look for me in a place full of dust and ledgers." Glenda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She reached for Ada's trembling hand and held it gently. "You were right to be frightened, but you were braver still to speak of it." Ada looked up at her. "You won't send me away?" "No," Glenda said softly. "I won't." Within the hour she had secured a small storeroom in the attic, unused but dry, and placed an extra blanket and a pot of tea beside the makeshift cot she fashioned from discarded drapery and crates. Ada curled up like a sparrow seeking shelter, her exhaustion overtaking her fear. As Glenda watched the girl drift into restless sleep, she felt a deep tremor move through her. Something had shifted in the still rhythm of her life. Something had entered, fragile, urgent, and utterly real. Later that afternoon, Glenda returned to the archive, shaken but composed. She resumed her work with an intensity born not of habit, but of purpose. If what Ada had said was true, and Glenda had no reason to doubt her, then the ledgers in this room might contain traces of the corruption that threatened to destroy Bath's most vulnerable streets. She had not been searching long when a voice behind her said, "Miss Hartwell, may I intrude?" She turned, surprised. A woman stood in the doorway, dressed in a finely tailored traveling gown of peacock blue. Her gloves were kid leather, her hat adorned with a subtle spray of black feathers. She had the air of London refinement, the kind that measured others with a glance and kept conversation clipped and efficient. "My name is Lady Margaret Albridge," the woman said, stepping into the room. "I've come from London to advise on the Assembly Room's charitable programming. I understand you've been restoring the archives." "I have," Glenda said, nodding. "It is slow work, but necessary." Lady Albridge offered a tight smile. "Your name has come up twice in London, once in relation to the Preservation Committee at the Royal Society, and once in a rather glowing letter written by Miss Wexley, formerly of Kensington Library. Your skill and discipline have not gone unnoticed." Glenda was still startled by the unexpected recognition. "I'm honored," she said carefully. The woman extended a calling card. "If you ever wish to consider a post more suited to your talents, I would be pleased to recommend you. We are in need of women with your mind and your discretion." With a brief nod, Lady Aldridge turned and swept from the room, leaving behind only the faintest trace of rosewater and ink. Glenda stared at the card in her hand, heart pounding. For a moment, her mind wavered toward a life she had never allowed herself to dream. One of quiet prestige, surrounded by ideas, respected for her intellect rather than her sacrifice. But then she remembered Ada's bruised voice. The way the girl had clung to her bundle like it held her only future. The ledgers filled with lies disguised as numbers, the streets that would be torn apart while the city dined in gilded halls. Glenda slipped the card into her satchel and returned to her work. That night, as Bath curled beneath the fog and the world beyond her window continued its quiet indifference, Glenda lit a second lamp and opened a ledger marked Surveyor's Office, 1879. Her eyes scanned the columns with growing urgency. Somewhere in these pages were the shadows of men like Sir Lionel, powerful, untouchable, and unkind. But shadows could be revealed, and ink, when brought to light, could wound just as deeply as a blade. Upstairs, the young girl slept while a storm gathered, still distant, but inevitable. And in the library below, a woman who had been dismissed by society as a spinster moved her finger slowly down a list of names, one by one. The winter mist rolled through Bath like a living thing, swallowing the city's sound and colour, until only the faint glow of gas lamps remained. In that half-world of shadow and silence, every carriage wheel seemed to echo twice, and every whisper carried farther than it should. It was in this damp grey hush that Glenda Hartwell began receiving the letters, each one written in a different hand, yet all sharing the same bitter perfume of menace. The first came folded within her morning newspaper. "Stay in your place," it read, the words pressed deep into the paper by a heavy nib. The second was slipped under her door, tied with a red string like a grotesque ribbon. "A woman who meddles in men's business soon regrets her curiosity." The third arrived pinned to her mother's shawl as it hung drying by the window. Glenda read each in stillness, her expression composed, though her heart beat hard enough to hurt. Fear did not come easily to her. She had seen too much illness, too many nights of uncertainty, to tremble over words. But these notes were not written in passion. They carried the measured cruelty of people who believed themselves untouchable. She said nothing to Mrs. Hartwell. Her mother's cough had deepened, and any agitation brought a tremor to her hands. Nor did Glenda confide in Ada, who now helped about the house like a small, determined ghost. The girl fetched medicines, tended the fire, and mended what she could without complaint. Yet Glenda caught her often glancing toward the windows, her young eyes dark with unspoken dread. "Do not worry," Glenda told her gently one morning. "We shall keep to ourselves and let the world do what it must." But the world would not leave her in peace. 2 days later, as dusk bled into the streets, a knock sounded at the library door. Glenda, still cataloguing by lamplight, hesitated. Visitors were rare at such an hour. The caretaker had already gone home. She moved cautiously toward the entrance, wiping the dust from her hands. When she opened the door, she found Julius Hawke standing there, hat in hand, his coat damp from the mist. The light from the corridor struck his face, highlighting the faint hollows beneath his eyes. He looked less like a duke than a man worn by long thought. "Miss Hartwell," he began, his voice low but edged with formality. "Forgive the intrusion at this hour. I was told I might find you still at work." "You were told correctly," she said, stepping aside. "Please come in. The cold will not improve for waiting." He entered, his boots leaving a trail of moisture on the stone floor. For a moment he simply stood there, taking in the sight of the library, the fragile stacks, the lamplight trembling over open books, the quiet order she had restored from ruin. Then his gaze settled on her, steady and unreadable. "I have heard rumors," he said finally, "disturbing ones. It has been suggested that you have involved yourself in matters best left to the proper authorities." Glenda met his eyes without flinching. If by matters you mean the integrity of the city's accounts, then yes, I have taken an interest. The ledgers do not lie, Your Grace. Only men do. A flash of something, irritation, or perhaps admiration, crossed his face. And what precisely do you think you have discovered? Instead of answering, Glenda reached for a folded sheet she had kept hidden among her papers. It was a torn page, brittle at the edges, filled with neat columns of numbers and one damning signature at the bottom. She handed it to him in silence. Julius unfolded it carefully, scanning the ink. His expression hardened as he read. "This bears Sir Lionel Pierce's hand," he said under his breath, "and mine beside it." "The lower sum," Glenda replied quietly, "was never received by the city. It was redirected through a holding company registered to a Mr. Alcott, who, I believe, is Sir Lionel's brother-in-law." Julius looked up sharply. "How did you obtain this?" "I found it misfiled among civic donations from 6 years past. No one bothered to check the discrepancies." He closed the paper slowly, his gloved fingers tightening around it. "You realize the danger you court by meddling in these affairs?" "I do," she said simply. "But danger is not a reason to remain silent." Their gazes locked across the narrow space between them, the lamplight trembling like breath between two hearts. Julius's voice softened, stripped of rank. "You should have brought this to me first." "And if I had," she asked, "would you have believed me?" The question struck him like a blade dulled by truth. He said nothing. The air around them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the city swallowed by fog. Finally, he set the paper down. "You are either very brave, Miss Hartwell," he murmured, "or very reckless." "Perhaps both," she answered. He moved closer, his presence filling the room. Glenda felt the nearness of him, the faint scent of rain on wool, the quiet authority that clung to every line of his posture. Yet beneath that power she sensed unease, as if the world he had built was beginning to fracture under the weight of her conviction. "You risk your livelihood," he said softly, "even your safety." Her lips curved faintly. "What is safety, Your Grace, when the truth is in danger?" The words hung between them like smoke. Julius studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the calm defiance that stirred something long dormant in him. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a strange mixture of frustration and wonder. "You are unlike any woman I have met in this city." "I take that neither as compliment nor insult," she replied, her voice steady though her heart beat unreasonably fast. A small silence followed, alive with the tension of two wills meeting for the first time as equals. Then Julius straightened, reclaiming the armor of his title. "You will give me this page," he said quietly, "and say nothing further of it." "I will make inquiries myself." Glenda's chin lifted. "I will trust your integrity, Your Grace, but not your influence. Influence built this corruption. It will not destroy it." His breath caught almost imperceptibly. No one, not even Parliament, spoke to him like that, yet there was no defiance in her tone, only truth. He inclined his head at last, half in surrender. "You speak boldly for someone with so much to lose." "I have already lost enough," she said. Julius looked at her one final moment, his eyes searching hers, as if to read what kind of heart could carry such quiet fire. Then he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "There are forces in Bath you do not understand, Miss Hartwell. I would advise you to tread carefully. And I," she said softly, "would advise you to look closely at the men who claim to serve you." The faintest smile touched his mouth, brief, admiring, almost sorrowful. "Good evening, Miss Hartwell." When he was gone, the silence that followed seemed deeper than before. Glenda let out the breath she had been holding and pressed her palm against the desk to steady herself. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange, unbidden current that had passed between them. That night, Bath was swallowed by fog so dense that the gas lamps flickered like dying embers. Glenda returned home by foot, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. The streets were nearly deserted. Only the faint cry of a street vendor echoed from the lower square. When she reached her boarding house, Ada was waiting by the window, her small face pale in the dim light. "Did he believe you?" the girl whispered. Glenda hesitated, removing her gloves. "He believed enough to be troubled," she said. "And sometimes that is where truth begins." Ada nodded, though her eyes remained clouded. "You shouldn't have gone alone. If they find out—" "They already have," Glenda interrupted gently. "That is why we must be cautious." She tucked the girl into bed and sat beside her until her breathing softened. Only then did Glenda allow the mask of composure to slip. She sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers until they blurred into tears. Her mother's coughing echoed faintly from the next room, a frail, persistent reminder of duty and love. She rose, prepared her mother's medicine, and helped her sip the bitter tonic. Mrs. Hartwell looked up at her daughter with weary affection. "You've been out late, my dear," she said between coughs. "Is the library keeping you so busy?" Glenda forced a small smile. "It keeps me from idleness, at least." Her mother's thin hand reached out and clasped hers. "Promise me you won't let the world make you hard." "I promise," Glenda whispered. When at last her mother slept, Glenda went to the window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living veil, erasing the world beyond. Somewhere in that shrouded distance walked the Duke of Merrow, a man bound by power, yet touched by doubt. Somewhere also lurked the unseen hands that threatened her. And there, between duty and danger, Glenda Hartwell stood, heart steady, resolve unbroken, knowing that her next choice could change everything. The wind that swept through Bath that night carried a breathless urgency, a warning cloaked in cold. It howled down the narrow lanes, bent the chimney smoke sideways, and scraped loose shutters against stone walls. The lamplight flickered along the colonnades of the assembly rooms as if unsure it should remain. Inside, the library slumbered in its usual hush, until flame touched paper. It began as a whisper, a crackle, faint and indistinct, hidden beneath the whistle of the wind. But soon the smoke curled beneath the door of the side room where Glenda had stored her newest findings, documents too fragile for handling, too damning to leave in plain view. It was Ada who saw the glow first, seeping through the gaps in the floorboards above. She had come down quietly, hoping to fetch her sewing scissors without waking Glenda or her mother. By the time Glenda reached the source, summoned by Ada's panicked cries, the fire had already claimed the edge of a shelf and blackened several volumes. She fought it not with panic, but with urgency, snatching a heavy woolen curtain from a window and beating at the flames. Ada brought a bucket from the yard, water sloshing over her shoes, and together they subdued it. The caretaker arrived only after it was done, breathless and confused, muttering about faulty lamps. But Glenda knew. She stood amid the scorched wreckage, her heart thudding, her hands blackened with soot. The ledgers she had worked on that week lay half-burned, pages curled like dried leaves, names and numbers charred into ash. Only a few sheets, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind the supply crates, had survived. "It wasn't the lamp," Ada whispered, staring at the blackened corner. "Someone meant to frighten us." Glenda did not speak. Her mind was already turning. The threats, the visits, the pressure mounting in silence. She glanced toward the stairwell, where the caretaker stood wringing his cap. His eyes would not meet hers. Later, after ensuring Ada was safe and the remaining ledgers secured, Glenda walked the long path home alone. But her steps turned, as if pulled by instinct, away from the boarding house and toward the upper crescent, where the city's grandest homes rose in serene, symmetrical arcs. The lamps along the wide curve cast their amber glow on the white facade of number 17, where ivy climbed the columns like frozen veins. There, in the shadow between lamp and doorway, stood Julius Hawke. He did not startle when she approached. He simply turned his head as though expecting her. The wind moved his coat gently, the edge of his scarf trailing like a ribbon of smoke. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his eyes, those unreadable eyes, were fixed on the house before him. Glenda came to stand beside him, her steps soft on the pavement. For a long moment they said nothing. The house loomed before them, windows dark, shutters drawn. A single lantern burned in the hallway beyond the glass, steady, contained. "She used to fill those rooms with voices," Julius said at last. His voice, always so deliberate, now carried the tremor of memory. Musicians, painters, writers no one had heard of. She would open the doors to them all. This very house was once deafening with ideas. Glenda turned slightly toward him but said nothing. "She was brilliant," he continued, almost to himself, "and impulsive. She could quote Shelley while ordering servants to rearrange the furniture for the 6th time in a day. She painted terribly, truly. Her technique was appalling, but she would gift her canvases to anyone who dared disagree with her." His lips curved faintly, though the expression never reached his eyes. "She died here," he said so quietly, the wind nearly stole the words. "Suddenly. Fever. 3 days between laughter and stillness. And the last thing I said to her was cruel." Glenda's breath caught. He had not looked at her once, but she felt the confession like a stone pressed into her hand. "I accused her of vanity," he went on, bitterness creeping into his tone, "of wasting money on salons and starving our estates. I told her I wanted peace, silence. She said I wanted obedience, not peace. Then she closed the door. The next morning she was too weak to rise." Now he turned. His eyes met hers at last, and she saw in them something she had never seen before, not aloofness, not calculation, but grief, naked and raw, long buried beneath titles and duties. "I stood in that hallway and did nothing while she called for me." Glenda stepped closer, slowly, until they stood only inches apart. She reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded handkerchief, pressing it into his hand without a word. Her fingers grazed his glove, lingered, then withdrew. "You were human," she said quietly. "Not cruel, not careless, human." He looked at the cloth in his hand. It was simple linen, edged with pale thread, the kind a daughter embroiders for a mother, or a woman carries for no one in particular. Slowly, he nodded and folded it away. "She would have liked you," he said. "You would have challenged her, and she would have loved you for it." "I would not have spared her your truth," Glenda replied softly, "but I might have made her tea afterward." The ghost of a laugh escaped him, dry but genuine. They stood in the quiet again. The wind carried the distant chiming of a carriage's bells. Above them, the moon peeked between clouds, a sliver of silver slicing the darkness. "She was buried at Lansdowne," he said after a time, "under the ash tree. She said it was the only place in Bath that didn't look like it was trying to impress anyone." Glenda offered a small smile. "Then I would have liked her too." Julius studied her face, as if memorizing it under this pale moonlight, as though some part of him knew this moment could not last. There was no touch, no embrace, no pledge, only the air between them, thick with things neither dared name. "Do you ever feel," he said almost reluctantly, "as though something is shifting beneath your feet, as though the world you understood is tilting, and you're not certain whether you're falling or merely learning to walk again?" "Yes," Glenda whispered, "more often than I let myself admit." Their eyes held, the silence between them deeper than words. Then Julius stepped back just slightly, and the distance reasserted itself, not cold, but necessary. "I must go," he said. "There are matters I must now question more closely than I ever intended." "Be careful," she said. The two words weighted with more than concern. He inclined his head. "And you." As he walked away, the night seemed to shift. Glenda watched him until he turned the corner and vanished into shadow. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding. She turned back to the house. Number 17 stood still and silent, yet something of its story now lived in her, etched by the man who had stood beside her, not as a duke, but as a widower, still learning how to grieve. When she returned home, she found Ada asleep in the chair by the hearth, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, one hand resting protectively over the box of rescued documents. Glenda bent and kissed the girl's brow gently, then sat beside her. The fire had burned low, but its embers still glowed, and in their quiet warmth she let her thoughts drift, not to danger nor duty, but to a man standing in the fog, haunted by the past, and to the sudden, impossible sense that their lives had already begun to entwine. The snow had not yet fallen, but Bath carried winter on its breath. The stone buildings glistened beneath a delicate frost, the pavements slick as polished glass, and every breath hung in the air like smoke from a candle's flame. The assembly rooms, once neglected and veiled in dust, now stood resplendent beneath strings of lanterns and wreaths of evergreen. Light spilled from its tall windows in soft waves of gold, and the low hum of anticipation drifted through the cold night, like a melody waiting for its first note. Inside, the grand ballroom had been revived for the season's first charity fete, an event sponsored by civic patrons to benefit the Children's Hospital. Musicians tuned their instruments beneath garlands of holly and red ribbon. Footmen in livery passed trays of warmed punch and spiced cakes, while the elite of Bath paraded their wealth in silk, velvet and diamond brooches that glittered beneath chandeliers. The air was fragrant with lavender and pomade, heavy with conversation that disguised judgment as pleasantry. In this world of orchestrated grace, Glenda Hartwell felt like a thread pulled loose from an elaborate tapestry. She stood near the edge of the crowd, dressed in a borrowed tea gown of muted damask blue, its fabric a generation out of style, but lovingly pressed by Ada's careful hands. Her hair was pinned in its usual modest bun, and at her throat shimmered a simple silver brooch, her only ornament. She wore no powder, no jewels, no lace gloves, and for all her composure, her presence drew eyes not out of admiration, but of confusion and quiet disdain. A group of ladies whispered behind their fans, their glances sharp as needles. "Who let the housekeeper into the drawing room?" one murmured. "I believe she's the librarian," said another, her voice edged with sugar. "The one restoring those dreadful ledgers. She looks rather like a governess, or worse, a spinster who reads too much." The words found Glenda's ears, but she kept her posture firm, her chin lifted. She had not come for their approval. She had come because she had been invited, and because she could not in good conscience hide in silence when the library now lived and breathed again because of her hands. Still, when the orchestra began to play a waltz and couples moved to the center of the room like petals drifting to water, a weight settled in her chest. She had danced once, long ago, before time had shaped her into someone more useful than admired. "Miss Hartwell." The voice arrived like a warm draught in a room grown cold. She turned, and there he stood, Julius Hawke, Duke of Merrow, dressed in deep black with a dark sapphire cravat that caught the lamplight like a secret. His hair, always perfectly combed, now bore the softness of something wind-tossed. His eyes met hers not with command, but with quiet intent. "You are radiant this evening," he said, and though the words were simple, they were not spoken idly. Glenda lowered her eyes briefly. "I cannot compete with the jewels and silks surrounding us." "You do not need to," he replied. "The room silences itself at your presence." She allowed herself a breath. "You flatter me." "I observe you," he corrected, his voice lower now. "There is a difference." Then, without waiting for approval from those who whispered and watched, he extended his hand. "Will you dance with me?" Glenda stared at the gloved hand before her, the music swelling behind them. Her breath caught at the space between propriety and the pull of something unspoken. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. A ripple passed through the crowd as they stepped into the center of the ballroom. Heads turned. The fans stilled mid-motion. The waltz carried them forward, and Julius guided her with a grace both surprising and deliberate. He did not perform, he accompanied. He did not lead with dominance, but with reverence, as though dancing with a woman who mattered, not in title, but in truth. Glenda moved with the rhythm, her steps sure though her heart thudded painfully beneath her bodice. Her fingers rested on his shoulder, and her other hand, enclosed in his, felt the steady pressure of reassurance. They said nothing at first, but every movement, every turn and breath was a sentence spoken in the language of restraint. "You should not have come alone," he said finally, his voice a thread between the notes. "I was not alone. Ada accompanied me." "Even so," he murmured, "I find myself resenting the eyes that have already tried to reduce you to nothing more than curiosity." "You cannot stop them from judging," she replied, "and I have long since stopped asking them for kindness." "I do not ask them," he said, "I defy them." They turned once more, the chandeliers casting fractal shadows over the floor. When the final note faded and applause rose like a tide, Glenda stepped back, her cheeks flushed. Julius bowed. She curtsied. The silence that followed their dance was not awkward. It was full. As they made their way to the edge of the ballroom, a woman in rich emerald stepped forward, her manner crisp and assured. "Miss Hartwell?" Glenda turned. The woman's face lit with familiarity. "Lady Margaret Albridge," she introduced herself. "I believe we met briefly several weeks ago. I must say I've heard nothing but praise regarding your restoration work." Glenda inclined her head. "You are kind to say so." Lady Albridge offered her a calling card. "I hope you will still consider the curatorship in London. The position remains open, and you would find the environment more appreciative of your discipline." Glenda took the card, folding it slowly into her gloved hand. "I will consider it." Lady Albridge's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, then turned to Julius with a knowing smile before disappearing into the crowd. Glenda felt Julius watching her. She did not meet his gaze. "She offers more than a position," he said softly. "Yes," Glenda murmured. "She offers an escape." "And is that what you want?" She did not answer. Outside, the wind had grown colder. Frost touched the edges of the windows, and the stars were shrouded in mist. Glenda slipped from the ballroom for a moment of air, stepping onto the stone balcony that overlooked the garden. The night pressed close, still and watchful. She barely noticed the man standing across the square. Ada did. From the far end of the assembly rooms, the girl had ventured out for a moment of her own, only to catch a figure staring too long in Glenda's direction. She paused, something uneasy rising in her chest. When the man moved into the shadows without greeting or noise, Ada turned quickly and disappeared back inside. Glenda remained on the balcony, unaware, the card in her hand burning like a weight she could not yet name. Moments later, Julius stepped beside her. "The frost suits this city," he said quietly. "It turns every surface to glass." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what do you see beneath the glass?" "A woman I did not expect," he said, "and whom I will not forget." She turned away, heart thudding, and they stood in silence once more. Close but untouched, seen yet unknown. Inside, the music began again, and the world resumed its masquerade. But out on the balcony, under a sky veiled in breathless cold, two souls stood on the edge of something fragile and unnamed, bound not by promise or gesture, but by a glance. A single glance that said more than a lifetime of words ever could. It was not the grand scandals that disturbed Julius Hawke most, but the small, deliberate distortions. He sat alone in the study of his townhouse, the room dim despite the early afternoon light. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth barely touching the frost in his bones. Before him, ledgers stretched in long rows across his mahogany desk, some so old their pages crumbled at the edge, others recent enough to still carry the scent of new ink. He had once trusted these numbers, as he trusted stone to hold its shape. But now, as his eyes moved from column to column, a strange nausea bloomed behind his ribs. A sum of £800, recorded as a maintenance stipend to the city, had in fact never left the estate. Another entry bore his signature, approving the construction of a railway annex. Yet the handwriting was unfamiliar, The ink too bold. With each discovery, his stillness deepened, like a man watching the foundation beneath him crack in silence. He did not summon his steward. He did not alert the board. Instead, he requested a meeting with Sir Lionel Pierce. It was held behind closed doors in the upper gallery of the Bath Club, where velvet chairs muffled protest and sherry flowed whether lies were told or not. Julius placed 3 marked ledgers on the table between them and waited. Sir Lionel took one glance and chuckled, a low, indulgent sound that grated beneath Julius's skin. "My dear Merrow," he said with an exaggerated sigh, "if one were to agonize over every ink blot in a ledger, one would never sleep again. These are bureaucratic flourishes, nothing more." Julius's expression did not shift. "Then explain this flourish, a tenfold inflation in acquisition costs, approved in my name." Sir Lionel swirled his glass. "Delegation, my friend. Surely you've learned that one cannot oversee every document in an enterprise of this scale." "And what of the holding companies?" Julius asked, voice tight. "The ones traced to your wife's cousin?" That drew a pause, a subtle narrowing of the eyes. "Watch your tone, Hawk. You're beginning to sound like one of those moralists who believes purity is a currency." He leaned back, smiling. "We are not monks, you and I. We are men who keep the wheels turning, and that means grease. It always has." Julius rose without a word. The ledgers remained on the table, but something else, something less tangible, had been taken with him. That evening, unable to still the storm building within him, he walked the length of Bath's Royal Avenue until his footsteps brought him to the place where truths refused to hide. The assembly rooms, and behind them, the quiet room where Glenda Hartwell worked late by choice rather than command. He found her bent over a table, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, the soft glow of a single oil lamp casting gold across her profile. Her hands moved with habitual precision, ink bottle to pen, page to ledger, as though the rhythm of order could keep the chaos at bay. "Miss Hartwell," he said quietly from the doorway. She turned, startled for only a breath, before she rose to meet him. "Your Grace, I need your help." The words were not grand, but they held weight. She studied him for a long moment, and something in his eyes, unspoken, weary, made her nod. He crossed the room and laid the suspect ledgers before her, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. "These books contain only fragments. I need the originals, the municipal copies, the land records, the contracts cross-referenced with estate distributions." "You're asking for a full audit," she said, opening one with care. "By candlelight and in secrecy. I trust no one else." It was not flattery. It was confession. Glenda's fingers moved across the columns, stopping where the ink faltered or the math frayed. She took her seat, already drawing out her notes and quill. "I will require tea," she said simply, without lifting her eyes. Julius smiled, wry, almost boyish, and removed his coat. For hours they worked side by side. Papers rustled, pages turned, and the wind outside knocked gently against the windows, as if it too sought entry to their circle of light. From time to time, their hands brushed, overlapping as they reached for the same page, the same ruler, the same lamp. The contact was incidental, but not forgettable. Once, her fingers lingered half a second too long upon his wrist. Another time, he steadied her inkpot with a palm placed closer than necessary. Neither spoke of it, but the air between them had thickened, dense with the weight of what could not be said. Not yet. At one point, Glenda stretched her spine and exhaled. Her ink-stained fingers trembled slightly from the hours spent gripping the pen. "You are relentless," Julius murmured, watching her. "Even I would have stopped by now." "I was raised by a vicar," she replied with a tired smile. "Endurance is our native language." He stood then, not to pace, but to pull something from the inner pocket of his coat, a folded paper worn soft at the creases. He stared at it a moment, his jaw taut, then extended it toward her. "I never showed this to anyone," he said, "not even her family." Glenda took it carefully and unfolded the single page. The ink was faint, the handwriting unmistakably feminine, bold in some places, rushed in others. A letter, unsent, unread. "I found it after her death," he explained. "It was addressed to me, but I burned it, or I thought I had. The edges were charred, but the message was whole. An apology, a lament, a plea for understanding from a woman who had dared to want too much. She regretted everything and nothing," Glenda said softly, scanning the lines. "She wanted to be forgiven, but she would never ask you to be less than you were." "She called me cold," Julius whispered, "and she was right." "No," Glenda said, meeting his eyes. "She called you afraid." The words struck him like a revelation he had never allowed himself to hear. And in that silence, thick and bare, she folded the letter and returned it to him, not as proof, but as mercy. "Forgiveness," she said, "is not a favor. It is a release." He stared at her, and this time the gaze did not waver. There were no titles between them now, no books, no ink, no false decorum, only breath and presence. Glenda looked away first. "The numbers confirm your suspicions," she said, clearing her throat. "If the final distribution report is falsified, it means nearly £2,000 vanished in under 3 months. Julius closed his eyes. "I was blind." "No," she said gently. "You were grieving, and the world knows how to speak to grief. It seduces it with distraction." He sat beside her again, the letter still in his hands. "What do I do now?" She turned the page toward him, her finger landing on a signature. "You begin here." And they began again, but slower this time, not with urgency but with something deeper, a shared understanding of how truth must be rebuilt, ledger by ledger, hour by hour. The candle burned low, their shoulders brushed more frequently now. Their silences lengthened, not with discomfort, but with a stillness that asked no explanation. When she rose to leave, he helped her with her shawl. His fingers brushed her neck, accidentally, of course, but both felt it. Neither looked away. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, her voice softer than the flame. "Julius," he said, almost under his breath. Glenda paused. Her eyes met his. "Julius," she repeated, and then she was gone. He stood alone by the table, surrounded by ink and ash and quiet beginnings. The rain fell softly on Bath that morning, a quiet drizzle that veiled the city in silver mist. The bells of St. Swithin's tolled in a slow, solemn rhythm, as if marking not the hour but the passage of something sacred and unseen. In the boarding house on George Street, the shutters remained drawn, and behind them a stillness had taken hold that no footfall dared disturb. Mrs. Hartwell had passed in the early dawn, her final breath a sigh lighter than the flutter of lace at a window. Glenda had sat by her side all through the night, her fingers laced around her mother's frail hand, listening to the steady rise and fall of a life that had given her everything: faith, courage, duty, and now silence. There had been no final word, no dramatic farewell. Only a soft pressure of fingers just before the end, a whisper of peace in the eyes that had seen both joy and loss. Glenda had pressed her lips to her mother's temple, brushed a silver curl from her brow, and held her as the warmth left the room inch by inch. The physician had come and gone. So had the landlady. With her well-meaning platitudes and tea no one touched, Ada moved quietly through the house like a shadow, eyes red, trying to help, but unsure how. The world beyond their walls carried on. Horses clattered, deliveries arrived, a neighbor quarreled with his cook. But inside, time had paused in reverence. Glenda did not weep. Not yet. Her sorrow was too deep for tears, too still. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it, with every tonic measured, every lullaby whispered during restless nights. But nothing prepares the soul for the absence of the one person who once knew you before you ever spoke. In the late afternoon, as the sky faded into the pale blue of a morning veil, a knock echoed at the door. Glenda did not stir from the chair where she sat beside the now quiet bed. Ada answered. and a moment later she returned to the room with a voice barely above breath. "It's His Grace, the Duke." Glenda looked up. "Show him in." Julius Hawke entered with the solemn grace of a man who understood loss not as concept, but as lived experience. He removed his gloves slowly, respectfully, and approached the bed without hesitation. "She was a woman of great strength," he said, gazing at the still form beneath the lace coverlet. "I see it in you." Glenda rose, her hands clasped before her. "She lived quietly, but with deep conviction." He nodded. "Those are the ones who shape us most." For a moment, the room held them in its gentle silence, the kind that asks nothing, demands nothing, only surrounds. Then Glenda moved toward the window and opened the shutters slightly. The light that filtered through was soft, almost holy. It caught the side of her face, revealing the delicate curve of her cheek, the weariness beneath her eyes, the strength behind her posture. "I feared I wouldn't feel anything when the moment came," she said, her voice steady. "I thought grief might pass me by like a ship I chose not to board, but it isn't like that." "No," Julius replied quietly. "It never is." He stepped closer, though not enough to invade. There was a reverence in his nearness, a care in his restraint. Glenda turned to face him. "I feel like I am floating," she confessed, "like I have been untethered from something that once held me firm to this world, and I don't yet know where I will land." He studied her, his gaze not piercing but anchoring. "You will land where you choose," he said, "not where you are placed." No, her eyes met his then, full of something unspeakable, fragile and fierce. They held each other in that suspended moment, two people bearing the same wound in different ways. Then Julius reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a small bundle, wrapped in linen and tied with a lavender ribbon. He placed it gently on the nightstand. "She once told me," he said, almost shyly, "that the scent of lavender reminded her of spring in Sussex, of beginnings." Glenda looked down at the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside was a single sprig of dried lavender, preserved with care. "She will carry it with her," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. Julius bowed his head, not as a duke, but as a man in mourning beside her. When he took his leave, he did so without another word, allowing her the dignity of her sorrow. But before he stepped out into the grey evening, he turned back once, his eyes meeting hers in a gaze filled with unspoken understanding. And then he was gone. The room felt emptier without him, but the lavender remained, and its scent filled the air like a prayer. Later that night, with the rain beginning to fall again in light, uncertain drops, Ada slipped out. She carried a sealed letter beneath her cloak, one of Glenda's notes meant for the editor of the Bath Chronicle, a continuation of their quiet inquiry into the false ledgers. The girl insisted on delivering it herself, wanting to help, to prove her worth. Glenda had hesitated, but Ada's determination won. The street was nearly deserted when Ada stepped onto the cobblestones, her boots skimming puddles, the letter clutched tightly in her palm. She walked with purpose, head lowered, shoulders drawn tight. She did not notice the figure that emerged from the alley until it was too late. A hand grabbed her arm. She yelped, instinctively trying to flee, but the man, tall, cloaked, held fast. "You think people won't notice a girl carrying secrets?" he hissed. "You don't know how to be invisible." Ada struggled, her heel slipping, but before the man could say more, a voice rang out, sharp, commanding. "Let her go." The attacker froze. Behind him stood a lamplighter, holding his torch high, face shadowed, but presence undeniable. The stranger cursed, shoved Ada aside and disappeared into the darkness. Ada fell to her knees, heart pounding. The lamplighter helped her up, handed her the letter she had dropped, and said nothing as she ran. She burst into the boarding house a quarter-hour later, drenched and trembling. Glenda met her at the door. "Did he hurt you?" she asked, hands on the girl's shoulders. Ada shook her head, though her eyes brimmed. "He tried, but someone stopped him." Glenda held her then, fiercely, as one would a child and a sister and a friend all at once. Over the girl's shoulder, she saw the lavender sprig still resting by the bed, and something inside her steeled. The world was no longer quiet. It stirred now, like an animal roused from sleep, and with it, danger moved closer, bolder, but so too did resolve. The next morning, Bath would wake to whispers, to suspicion, to shifting glances in coffee houses and guild meetings, and though the sky remained grey and the chill still clung to the air, something had changed. A woman had buried her mother, a man had offered memory instead of power, a girl had escaped the hand of silence, and in the quiet heart of the city, beneath a veil of mist and grief, a flame was beginning to rise. The sky over Bath was pale and brittle, the colour of porcelain just before it breaks. A sharp wind swept through the colonnades, rustling newspapers, snapping shawls loose, and stirring whispers already blooming in the air like winter flowers. It was the day the city had been waiting for, the day of the public assembly at the pump room, a celebration of the progress promised by the railway expansion. But beneath the gilded ceilings and marble pillars, no one celebrated. The pump room was crowded beyond decorum. Merchants in stiff cravats, aldermen with polished canes, bankers, builders, politicians, society ladies dressed for spectacle, all pressed into the vast hall as if proximity to power might secure their fortunes. Servants moved quietly through the edges, refilling cups of tea that no one drank. The orchestra, hired for civility, stood unused in the corner. In the centre of the room, an elevated platform had been built with cruel irony, its mahogany polished to a sheen, its brass fixtures gleaming, the very image of advancement. Behind it hung a banner stitched with ambition, a new era for Bath, commerce, connection and community. And standing beside it, Sir Lionel Pierce basked like a cat in sunlight. He wore a navy morning coat with a bright yellow waistcoat, a pocket watch chain that glittered with every self-satisfied gesture. His sideburns were freshly trimmed, and his smile, sharp, false, stretched too far. Julius Hawke had not yet arrived. That was the murmur moving like a current through the room. Where was the Duke of Merrow? Where was the signature that would seal the final phase of expansion? Where was the aristocrat whose silence had always meant approval? Near the back of the room, just beyond the row of tall windows, Glenda Hartwell waited in the shadows, her expression unreadable. Beside her stood Ada, her hands trembling within her gloves, her hair pinned with care that morning, though a single curl had already escaped in protest. "You don't have to speak," Glenda said gently, her hand resting on the girl's arm. "I want to," Ada replied, her voice thin but steady. "I won't run again." Glenda looked at her, pride blooming like warmth through the frost. The hush fell gradually, like mist settling on water as Julius entered the room. He wore no ceremonial sash, no extravagant coat, just a dark, impeccably tailored suit, gloves in one hand, and a folder tucked beneath the other. He moved with the weight of someone who had made a choice and would not take a single step back from it. All eyes turned to him. Sir Lionel's smile faltered. Julius mounted the platform without fanfare, placed the folder on the lectern, and nodded once toward the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast marble hall, "thank you for your presence. I shall be brief." Sir Lionel stepped forward then, smile reaffixed. "If you'll permit me, Your Grace," he said loudly, "perhaps I might begin with a few remarks regarding the significance of this partnership between progress and principle." He reached for the lectern, but Julius did not move. "I believe," Julius said coolly, "that before we speak of principles, we ought to speak of the truth." A silence like held breath descended. "In recent weeks," Julius continued, his tone calm but unyielding, "it has come to my attention that several financial records connected to the proposed railway expansion have been altered. Funds intended for civic use were rerouted, contracts approved without my review, and signatures, my own included, were forged or misused. A ripple passed through the crowd, sharp as wind through dry leaves. I have investigated these discrepancies personally, with assistance." He looked toward the back of the room, and slowly, Glenda and Ada stepped forward. Their presence was a shock. Glenda in her plain wool coat, hair swept back in neat simplicity. Ada, pale but composed, held a folded sheet of parchment close to her chest. They climbed the platform slowly, Glenda's hand never far from the girl's back. "This young woman," Julia said, "was a witness to one of the clandestine meetings where these actions were orchestrated, and she possesses a ledger fragment which, until now, remained hidden." Ada unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "This page shows a payment of £280 to a man named Harold Dent, signed by Sir Lionel Pierce," she said. "Mr. Dent told me he was paid to fabricate estimates and destroy older records. I heard the conversation myself." Gasps. A few voices rose in disbelief, some in immediate defense. Sir Lionel laughed. "A seamstress's apprentice and a retired clergyman's daughter," he said, shaking his head. "This is what you offer as testimony." He turned to the crowd. "My friends, we are being asked to abandon the future of this city for the whims of a—" He looked directly at Glenda, eyes sharp, voice curling with contempt. "A meddling spinster and her ward." There was a murmur, half amusement, half discomfort. But Julius's voice rang out, crisp as glass breaking. "That woman," he said, pointing to Glenda, "sacrificed sleep, safety, and peace to uncover what I was too arrogant to question. She has more honor than any man I have done business with in the last decade." Sir Lionel straightened, flushed with fury. "You would destroy your own alliances for her?" "I would destroy my silence," Julius replied, "which allowed this to happen." He turned to the crowd again, not with a politician's flourish, but with a man's conscience laid bare. "I, Julius Hawke, Duke of Merrow, formally withdraw my support from the Bath Railway expansion as it currently stands. I return my shares to the city's discretion, and I will offer financial reparation to the families displaced by the fraudulent negotiations I unknowingly endorsed." A stunned silence followed, and then scattered applause, slow, uncertain at first, then building in strength as eyes turned not to Sir Lionel, but to Julius, to Glenda, to Ada. Sir Lionel stepped back. A single bead of sweat glistened on his temple. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no one was listening. Julius gestured to the constable waiting at the door, who moved to escort Ada safely from the hall. She looked at Glenda, who nodded once. Then the girl disappeared into the growing swell of voices. The room, now fully awake, erupted. Questions flew, challenges, accusations, but Julius stepped down from the dais without another word. Glenda followed him, the weight of the moment etched into every step. Outside, the wind had grown wild. The sky had darkened, not with rain, but with the turning of something larger than weather, public opinion, integrity, change. That evening, as dusk fell like ash over the city, word spread that Sir Lionel Pierce had boarded a coach bound for London. No farewells, no farewell speech, just retreat. 3 days later, the Bath Chronicle published the headline in bold print: "Former railway patron under investigation for fraud. Duke of Merrow resigns in scandal's wake." And in a small room lined with ledgers and candlelight, a woman who had once been dismissed as irrelevant laid her ink-stained hands on the desk and breathed, not in triumph, but in resolve, because the reckoning had come, and the work was only beginning. The winter sun in Bath was a pale, wan thing, filtered through milky clouds and casting long, soft shadows across the stone facades of Queen Square. There was no warmth in it, but still it glinted faintly on the windows of shops and carriages as the city braced itself for the shifting of its foundations, not of brick and stone, but of power, perception, and pride. The scandal had broken like frost cracking along a pane of glass, quiet at first, then splintering loudly in every direction. By the second day after the meeting at the pump room, the Bath Chronicle printed in bold type, Railway fraud exposed. Duke of Merrow withdraws backing. On the 3rd, broadsheets in Bristol and London followed suit, and by the 4th, Sir Lionel Pierce's name was no longer spoken with reverence in gentlemen's clubs or dining halls. His assets were frozen, his townhouse shuttered, his wife sent to relatives in Sussex, and his manservant, once proud to wear crimson livery, dismissed with half wages and a bitter silence. In the boardroom where Julius Hawke had once sat at the head of a polished oak table, no one left a seat open for him. His name remained printed on the minutes, but it was spoken only in dry, clipped tones. The Duke will no longer be involved. Yes, he's taken a philanthropic turn. There were smirks behind closed doors, of course. Men whispered of lost advantage and called it sentimentality. Julius endured it all in silence. He had lived a life built on contracts, on the weight of a signature, on the quiet triumph of strategic silence. But now he walked differently through the streets of Bath, less with purpose, more with attention. The faces he had never paused to notice before, the tired laundress, the paper-boy with red-knuckled hands, the man cradling a broken arm as he begged outside the post office, now seemed to watch him back. He no longer rode in a closed carriage, nor did he wear his signet ring. What need had he now of symbols? Instead, he poured himself into reparation. A modest estate on the outskirts of Weston had been quietly sold, and with the proceeds, Julius created a trust. His own money, free of syndicate entanglement, placed in the hands of neutral solicitors. The purpose was clear: to fund safe, clean housing for those families who had been displaced by the false promises of urban advancement. He visited the courts himself, spoke with mothers, took notes in the margins of a small black book, and asked no one to publish his name beside the deeds. There was only one person whose eyes he longed to meet again: Glenda. At the assembly rooms, the scent of parchment and dust had become oddly comforting to her. The library, though still quiet, breathed differently now. Its shelves were fuller. Young girls from the courts came in shy clusters, peeking behind volumes, their fingers ink-stained, their curiosity fierce. Glenda, no longer simply the woman restoring old ledgers, had begun giving informal reading lessons twice a week. She kept her sleeves rolled to the wrist, a black ribbon at her throat, and a small bell in her drawer to summon help if Ada ever failed to appear on time. But Ada did appear, every Sunday like clockwork. Dressed neatly in navy calico, with her hair combed into a tidy braid and her chin held just a bit higher than before, she would bring Glenda a parcel of warm scones or a new piece of embroidery to critique. She spoke of the dressmaker's shop with cautious joy. "Madam Rowan says I have a fine hand for lace edging," she said one morning, her eyes shining. Glenda reached out, brushed a thread from the girl's cuff, and smiled. "That's because your work was always careful, even when your world was not." In the quiet of her own room, however, Glenda sometimes sat staring at a letter. The envelope was cream-coloured, the script elegant, and the seal bore the mark of the Royal Society's archives in London. The woman who had once approached her at the charity fete had kept her word. The curatorship was real, a respectable salary, a fine lodging, and access to some of the most important collections in the kingdom. Glenda had not opened the letter for 2 days. When she finally did, she read it twice and then placed it beneath a stack of journals. Neither declined nor accepted. It sat there still, an unopened door she was not yet ready to walk through. Outside, February's breath wrapped the city in damp mist. It curled around chimney pots and crept beneath doors, settling in bones and thoughts alike. Julius walked often in that mist. He kept to the shadows of terraces and colonnades, not to hide, but to observe. From a distance, he watched Glenda move through her new rhythm, greeting girls at the library door, sorting cloth donations, pausing by the window to sip her tea and glance toward the square. Once he saw her place a volume of poetry on a small shelf marked "For Borrowing," and gently brush her thumb along the spine before setting it down. Another time, He witnessed her helping a girl tie her shoelace, kneeling on cold stone as if she had all the time in the world. She was not dazzling. She was not youthful, nor fashionable, nor adored by salons, but she was purposeful, and she burned with a quiet dignity that shamed every room that had once overlooked her. Julius stood in the doorway of a bakery, uncertain whether to cross the square. The fog clung to his shoulders like doubt. A boy selling papers passed him, crying headlines of Sir Lionel's downfall. Julius bought one and tucked it under his arm, unopened. He had once believed that silence was strength, that distance was wisdom, that emotion made men weak. But now, every time he saw Glenda's unguarded face, creased with fatigue, brightened with kindness, set in thoughtful stillness, he realized how wrong he had been. And yet he did not approach her. Not yet. Because something in her still belonged to her grief, to her duty, to her books, and her stubborn, unspoken refusal to yield. And he would not take that from her. Not until she chose. Back at her desk, Glenda read the newspaper and sighed. The article detailed Sir Lionel's arrest, the seizure of properties, and murmurs of parliamentary inquiry. There was a line about the Duke of Merrow having withdrawn financial interest and redirected funds toward reparative housing. No quote, no photograph, just a line. She folded the paper, touched the ribbon at her throat, and resumed her work. Behind her, a new shelf stood half-filled. A sign, written in Glenda's own careful hand, read, "To those who seek truth." She had once believed her life would be a footnote in other people's stories, but now she was writing in the margins, and others were reading. And somewhere, watching, a man who had once ruled the rooms of Bath in silence now stood beneath her window, uncertain not of his love, but of whether he still had the right to speak it. It would be some time before he knocked, but the city was changing, and so was she. It was a Thursday morning. Though the calendar seemed irrelevant to the hush that settled over Bath, the winter fog had begun to lift at last, and the sun poured across the honey-coloured stones of the assembly rooms, gilding them as if the city wished to remember its grandeur after so many reckonings. The air was still crisp, but it bore the promise of warmth, like the first breath of a long-awaited spring. Inside the library, the silence was of the gentlest kind. Not hollow nor abandoned. It was the hush of care, of books breathing in new order, of coats being hung without clamour, of pages turning with purpose. It was the silence of someone working with reverence. Glenda Hartwell stood at the donation table near the east alcove, sorting through a crate of second-hand volumes. Her sleeves were pushed to her forearms, her hands covered in the faint dust of oaken bindings and twine. Her dark wool gown, though modest, bore a neat white collar pinned with her mother's small pearl brooch, its glow softened by time and memory. She did not see him at first. Julius Hawke, Duke of Merrow, no longer in any manner that mattered, had entered without fanfare. His coat was plain, brown and well worn at the cuffs, and his gloves were held in one hand rather than on it. His boots bore the marks of actual walking, not riding. His hair, once so precisely brushed, now held a touch of unruly softness above his brow. He stood just inside the doorway, watching her with a gaze that held no trace of titles, only truth. She looked up, startled only slightly, but the recognition that passed between them was neither dramatic nor sudden. It was simply inevitable. He offered a small nod. "You are difficult to find alone these days, Miss Hartwell." Glenda's hand stilled on a cloth-bound ledger. She studied him quietly, then tilted her head. "That's because I am rarely alone, Mr. Hawke. There's always something, someone, to tend." His lips curved in something close to a smile. "And yet, here you are." She did not answer right away. Instead, she gestured softly to the stack of books before her. Donations. The fates stirred generosity, or perhaps curiosity. Either way, the city has begun to remember this room. He stepped further in, slowly, as if every pace mattered. "The city has you to thank for that. She exhaled a quiet breath, as if bracing against sentiment. The city has itself to thank. I merely resisted its forgetting. There was a long silence. He drew closer, but not close enough to touch her. I was told, he said gently, that you received another letter. Glenda nodded once. I did. The position in London remains open, and I remain undecided. His gaze dropped to the floor, then slowly returned to her. I had no wish to interfere. But I have not spoken with you since the end of everything else. I came today not as someone with authority or ambition, not as a man seeking to be forgiven, only as a man who once failed to see the full weight of quiet virtue. Glenda looked down at her ink-smudged fingers. And what do you see now? He took another step toward her, his voice low. A woman who gave me back the best of myself, not by offering it, but by challenging me to earn it. Her expression did not soften immediately. If anything, it sharpened, eyes narrowing slightly, the way a woman does when she is weighing not a man's words, but the soul behind them. I did not ask you to change, Julius, she said, and her voice carried the strength of every day she had chosen her own path. Nor did I expect you to follow. I know, he replied, but I followed all the same, not because you needed it, but because I did. Another silence, heavier this time. She turned, walked to a shelf near the hearth and reached for a small volume wrapped in linen. Returning to him, she placed it in his hands. He opened it. It was poetry, the book she had saved from the fire. His fingers trembled as he turned a page. Pressed between two verses, there lay a pressed leaf of lavender. She spoke before he could. I don't want to be adored, Julius. I've never belonged in salons, and I've no desire to be a duchess. What I want is a partner who listens when I am silent, who stands beside me when it would be easier to walk away. Someone who understands that love is not something owed. It is something offered and accepted freely. He closed the book gently, his voice a whisper. Then I have come with only one offering, myself, without pretense, without rank, without anything more than what is left in me after losing everything that did not matter. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with clarity. She reached out and took his hand. Slowly, purposefully, she guided it until it rested atop the poetry volume between them. I saved that book, she said, because I wanted to remember that even fire cannot take everything. And in that moment, no more words were needed. Outside, the sun broke through the last of the mist. They walked together through the assembly rooms, past empty chairs, past windows aglow with amber light, past the ghosts of what had been lost. The fete began just after dusk. The library had never looked more alive. Lamps glowed from every alcove. Banners sewn by the girls from the courts fluttered gently above the stacks. Music, violin and pianoforte drifted through the corridors like a hymn to new beginnings. There was laughter, quiet applause, and the scent of tea and cinnamon biscuits. People gathered not to flaunt but to share. A woman in her 40s with a sturdy waist and a warm smile guided a group of children toward the storytelling corner. A young man with a speech impediment read aloud for the first time, and a seamstress in borrowed velvet served punch with the composure of a queen. And in the center of it all, beneath a string of paper lanterns, Glenda and Julius danced. It was not a waltz of the elite. There was no orchestra, no diamond tiara, no audience breathless with envy. There was only the hush of reverence. They moved slowly, not in perfect rhythm, but in perfect trust. His hand on her back was steady. Her cheek near his shoulder was at peace. Neither spoke. They had said all that needed saying. Near the librarian's desk, a newspaper lay folded. On the front page, the headline read, City Council votes to reroute railway under public trust. It lay beside an ink pot and a slip of Glenda's handwriting, now slightly smudged. New acquisitions to be shelved with care. On her neck, the pearls her mother once wore shimmered softly with the light of the lanterns. They did not glint. They glowed. as did she, as did he. And somewhere between the silence and the music, between the past and what now came after, they found not just each other, but home. The winter of 1888 arrived early in Bath, trailing a silver shawl of frost across the Georgian rooftops. Chimneys whispered smoke into the pale sky, and the trees lining the crescent had long since surrendered their golden leaves. The city, older now and softer at its edges, moved more slowly than it once had. But in the mornings, as the mist lifted from the River Avon, there was still a kind of quiet resilience in its stones, like the echo of a voice that once dared to speak when it was easier to remain silent. Inside the assembly rooms, the library had changed. The velvet ropes were gone. The door, once locked to all but the highest born, now swung open 6 days a week, and on Saturdays, children from the courts dragged muddy boots across its floors to find stories waiting for them like old friends. The shelves were fuller, the air was warmer, and at the librarian's desk there remained a woman with steady hands and a gaze that softened the loudest room. Glenda Hawke, once Hartwell, stood by the window, her shawl drawn close. Her hair, streaked now with silver, had been twisted into a loose bun that morning by a small pair of determined fingers. Outside, laughter burst from the courtyard, a pair of girls chasing one another in worn boots, shrieking joy into the air. One of them, the younger, looked up. "Mrs. Hawke," she called, "he's here." Glenda turned, her hand still resting on the sill, and there he was. Julius, now 60, crossed the courtyard with a slow, measured gait. The limp from an old riding injury had worsened with the years, but he bore it without complaint. He wore a dark wool coat, a scarf knitted by small hands, and carried under one arm a parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. He stopped short of the threshold and looked up at her. It had been 6 years since he returned to the assembly rooms, not as a duke, but as a man. 6 years since they'd chosen to walk forward, together. And they had, not without hardship. The title of Duke of Merrow still followed them in court documents and tax forms, but they lived modestly in a townhouse near the Abbey. The great Merrow estate had long been sold, its profits redirected toward housing initiatives that now stood in place of the slums once marked for demolition. Julius had refused every petition to return to the board of directors. He taught arithmetic at the Mechanics' Institute and wrote quietly in the evenings, his ledgers long replaced by letters. The city had changed, slowly but deeply. The railway was rerouted, as promised, beneath public trust. The people of Bath, once skeptical of reform, had begun to believe in their own stewardship. Women were reading in public, owning property, raising voices in town halls. The name Glenda Hawke had appeared on more than one petition, though she never signed it herself, her pupils did. Ada Finch, now 23, managed a small dress shop near the Royal Crescent. She was not married, but had a tabby cat named Rilke, and a fierce pride in her independence. She visited the library every week with fabric swatches in her pockets and gossip tucked beneath her tongue. Sir Lionel, disgraced and tried in London, had died in prison 2 years prior. Few mourned. None spoke his name without a shadow. The assembly rooms no longer bore the hush of ghosts, only memories. On that morning, frosted and bright, Glenda descended the library steps to meet Julius at the door. He offered the parcel with a slight bow. "For your collection," he said, voice lower now, but still rich with the music of intention. She unwrapped it gently. It was a first edition of Persuasion, the spine worn but the pages pristine. Inside, the inscription read, "For the woman who taught me the value of being known, not admired." Her fingers trembled on the page. They said nothing more. They did not need to. As midday bells rang from the abbey beyond, they walked together to the reading alcove, where the children had already gathered with cushions and impatience. Glenda sat with the book open on her lap. Julius lowered himself beside her, knees stiff, but eyes bright. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft, persistent, familiar. Inside, surrounded by stories and second chances, A duke and a librarian turned the page together, and in that moment, nothing else mattered but the chapter still to come. What a journey! The widow duke and the 39-year-old spinster was never just about titles, betrayals, or even love. It was about second chances, those we give to others, and perhaps more importantly, those we finally dare to give ourselves. It reminded us that it's never too late to speak up, to begin again, to build something lasting from the ashes of what once was. Glenda and Julius showed us that love doesn't always arrive wrapped in youth and ease. Sometimes it comes through fire, loss, and silence, and it waits at the library door when both hearts are finally ready. If this story moved you, left you breathless, or gave you even the softest glimmer of hope, I invite you to tell us below. What part stayed with you the most? And if you read, or felt, every page of this journey, write the word "ready" in the comments. That one word tells us you were with us until the very end, and it means more than you know. If you'd like to help us continue creating stories like this, romantic, historical, and rich with soul, consider sending a super thanks here on YouTube. Any amount, large or small, helps keep our candle burning, and if that's not possible right now, no worries at all. Just sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who needs a little beauty in their day is a beautiful way to support us too. Don't forget to explore more love stories like this one in the suggested videos and cards. We've saved a seat for you in everyone. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing that even the quietest hearts deserve to be heard. Until the next story.